Hey everyone, welcome to MintCast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I'm your host, Manar Mohawish Adli. Now, for far too long, government agencies have attempted to censor or infiltrate news organizations in an attempt to control the message. The US is no exception to this. Turn on your TV to watch cable news, and you are bound to quickly run into a former employee of a three-letter agency telling you what to think on issues of politics and security. But our guest today has been delving deeper into the growing and alarming ties between the national security state and social media as the government increases its control over Silicon Valley. Alan MacLeod is senior staff writer at MintPress. Now, he joined us in 2019 after completing his PhD at the Glasgow University Media Group. He's an expert in global media theory, and he has published 2 books on the topic, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's good to be with you again, Manar.
So in your latest article that's published on MintPress News, you explored the troubling past of Reddit director of policy, Jessica Ashush. Could you tell us what you found about her and her relationship with the national security state?
Yeah, sure. So maybe first a little bit about Reddit. It's a very influential social media and news site. It's actually the 8th most visited site in the United States. And it's got this reputation as being a sort of anarchic, anti-establishment place to go and where people have discussions. But a few years ago in 2017, Jessica Ashush was appointed as director of policy, and that was really out of left field because when you look at her background, she is essentially a foreign policy hawk. She had jobs at the Cato Institute, at the Council of Foreign Relations, but perhaps most notably, she was working at the Atlantic Council, which is essentially a NATO front group. And there she was working directly under Madeleine Albright and Stephen Hadley. Albright was, I believe she was Secretary of State under the Clinton administration. She was one of the people who was most directly involved in the violence in the Middle East. She famously went on television and said that 500,000 dead Iraqi children was a price worth paying for trying to put the pain to Saddam Hussein. Stephen Hadley, of course, was one of the real intellectual architects of the Patriot Act. He was one of the key men in the Bush administration. And so these are the sorts of people that Ashush has been working under for years. And at the Atlantic Council, she was a Middle East expert, and her favorite subject was probably Syria. That was really what she was concentrating on. She was a scholar at Oxford University, then hot-housed into these very hawkish, warlike Washington institutions. And she has absolutely no background in social media or in marketing. And so it was very suspicious that she was given this job, especially it was at directly the time when government officials, members of Congress, was talking about how the internet needed to be much more tightly regulated on the grounds of hate speech, on the grounds of, the rising far right, and on the grounds of disinformation, particularly coming from foreign actors. And so this really started people thinking that maybe she was some sort of government plant, especially as she's dedicated her life to looking at how the US can increase its control and influence over the Middle East. And so, I think this is a very worrying development, and it's one we're seeing in other social media websites as well.
Well, Reddit is really interesting. As you mentioned, it's one of the top 8 websites in the whole world, accruing and attracting billions of views to its website. So it has a lot of influence about the free flow of information. Reddit has been obviously under the microscope for how much censorship takes place there. I know MintPress specifically has been shadow banned on Reddit, and a lot of independent and alternative media outlets have been shadow banned on Reddit that cover Western imperialism and the military industrial complex. But, you make a really good point that she has she herself focuses a lot on the Middle East, which is where the United States is operating very heavily under the guise of the war on terror. Talk to me about her background with Middle Eastern dictatorships like the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, sure. So when Ashur was appointed in 2017, I went back and checked and just to see if any media outlet had even commented about it. And I could find absolutely nothing on Google or on Dow Jones, Factiva, or any of the big news databases. So that was pretty suspicious, especially when you look at her LinkedIn page, where she just proudly displays what she's been up to. So for a number of years, she was working directly for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the UAE, where she worked directly underneath an Emirati Air Force general, a retired one. And she says in her own LinkedIn page that her particular focus working for the UAE was to devise and advise them on their Syria policy. Now, anyone who knows much about the war in Syria knows that the UAE have been funding jihadist groups like all of them, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all of these groups that are mixed in together to form what most people call just the opposition or the rebels. This is particularly surprising and worrying. Joe Biden himself in a Q&A session in 2014 said that the Emiratis have poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who they were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadists coming from other parts of the world. And so that was a direct quote from him. And so this is really what Ashur's been doing. It seems, reading between the lines, that she's really been advising the UAE on how to better train, fund, and arm these Islamist jihadist rebel groups that have done so much devastation, not just in Syria, but of course across the entire Middle East. And again, if you look at her output, she for years was writing in big outlets like the New York Times, talking about. She had, for instance, she had an op-ed there that demanded that the US better fund the opposition and arm them with anti-aircraft missiles or anti-tank shells or what have you. She also, even though she's, I think, probably kind of mainstream corporate Democrat in her own political views, she really chastised Barack Obama in the pages of the Washington Post, saying that he had essentially failed to act in Syria, and that Donald Trump now has this golden opportunity to right wrongs and, as she said, quote, restore US credibility in Syria. In that article, she also said that she was part of quite a high-level team who, right after the suspected chemical attack in Douma in 2013, so that was the Ghouta attack, she flew to Istanbul and met with representatives of the United States, of the Syrian opposition, and also regional leaders to try to come up with some sort of strategy to counter Assad. So she was clearly a very high player in this game. She also worked for the government of Iraq, working for a company that was very much, involved in the rebuilding of Iraq. So again, that company had a lot of ties to the US government and the US military. She, in contrast with her dislike of Syria, she's got very much an affinity for both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And that really kind of takes the shine off of her supposed opposition to Middle Eastern dictators. In fact, I found an article where she was asked what her dream job would be, and she said it would be to be the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And she's even got an article at Market Watch where she describes how the government of Mohammed bin Salman is so progressive and so forward-thinking, and they're really changing the Middle East for the better and making it a dynamic
Sounds like place to go live in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah, incredible.
And be a woman there, right?
So yeah, I mean, that's what she was doing, working for these companies and these governments. And so this whole, quantum leap to becoming the director of policy for a sort of social media website, which mostly has tech people on their board or marketing people, is deeply suspicious indeed. And yeah, as I said, it does mirror what happened with Facebook and also with Twitter at the same time.
Right. And, she sounds like a typical neoliberal hawk is what she sounds like. And these are the very people that work directly with think tanks, hawkish think tanks like the Atlantic Council, who are directly funded by Saudi Arabia and by weapons manufacturers like Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and apartheid Israel. And they're very much allied with the Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton establishment hawks, neoliberal hawks that promote war and profit off of war. And so before we talk about the Atlantic Council, I'm just curious to know, how has her being the policy director at Reddit influenced their coverage, influenced the information that makes it to Reddit? Like, if you were to look at Reddit right now, could you see a direct link between her being a policy director and the kind of articles and links and posts that are allowed, or the kinds of conversations that are allowed? Because, when Reddit was first started, it was all about, freedom of expression and this place where people can just openly discuss and post anything. Like, where are we at right now after her being appointed to this position?
Well, I think it's impossible to say that, one thing, proves the other, but her appointment is certainly another point of reference in a real gradual but quite distinct change in what Reddit had started off as being and to what Reddit became. So for years and years, Reddit was this kind of run along very strict libertarian free market, marketplace of ideas, ideology, where they absolutely anathema to banning anything. And that really got them in a lot of trouble. They hosted a lot of really serious content, illegal stuff, streaming stuff, piracy, a lot of illegal porn, even child stuff as well, which was, pilloried in the press and, potentially quite rightly, but they stuck to this sort of model. But I think when Reddit was bought by Condé Nast, which is a big publisher which owns a ton of magazines, I think that was one of the signals that it was going to change in policy and become much more advertiser friendly. And certainly since Ashu came in 2017, Reddit's revenue has gone through the roof as marketers and advertisers and big businesses have seen the value in advertising with them. But Ashu has certainly, if not been the principal architect, certainly overseen a real change in policy in Reddit. So we've seen, in one day in 2018, she decided to ban over 1,000 communities on Reddit. A lot of the most notorious ones are gone, like, for instance, the Donald Trump subreddit, the Donald, that was one of the major organizing locations for the movement to get him elected as president. It was one of the most active communities. They've banned a lot of racist ones, a lot of questionable things that might get them in trouble with big companies who want to advertise with them. But also, as they've banned right-wing ones, they've also banned left-wing ones, like, for instance, Chapo Trap House, which was the biggest left-wing organizing subreddit going. And so it's kind of this tit-for-tat thing where increasingly there is a sort of beltway of expressible opinion on Reddit where you're not really encouraged to go out with those bounds of expressibility. And, you can basically say that Reddit is very slowly turning into more of a mainstream place to get your news rather than an alternative one.
Okay, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, I know a lot of independent media outlets have been shadow banned or completely blocked from sharing their links compared to 10 years ago or 8 years ago where, MintPress could have made it to the front page of Reddit, where right now that's pretty much impossible. Let's talk about the relationship between Ashu, and by the way, I called her Ashush at the very beginning. It's Ashu. Her relationship with the Atlantic Council and the Atlantic Council's relationship with social media, tech giants, and why this is so dangerous.
Well, for those who don't know, the Atlantic Council, as I said before, is essentially NATO's brain. It's the think tank that is aligned with NATO. That I think that's one of the reasons why it's called the Atlantic Council, from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it's funded by NATO, by all branches of the US military, by the US government, by NATO member states, by Gulf dictatorships like the UAE, I believe, and also by big companies, big tech companies, and big weapons contractors. And if you look at their board of directors, it really gives you a feeling for what their outlook is. On that board, we've got famous, infamous war planners like Henry Kissinger, who was, the architect of all the terrible genocidal wars in Indochina that the US waged in the 1960s and 1970s. You've also got a lot of Bush-era neocons like Condoleezza Rice or Robert Gates or Colin Powell. They're on the board too. There's a swath of military generals like General H.R. McMaster, David Petraeus, General Wesley Clark, Admiral James Stavridis is on there as well. And not only that, there's also no fewer than 7 former directors of the CIA on there, like Leon Panetta, Michael Hayden, and many others. I think, in fact, a majority of the living ex-CIA directors are on that. And so really the Atlantic Council kind of represents the ultimate centrist establishment think tank for foreign policy for NATO. And so it's very hawkish. It's very sort of, bipartisan in that sense. But they've also, as I said, on their board, they've got the architects of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
Exactly, yeah.
The Atlantic Council have certainly been somebody who has, really got themselves involved in the political milieu in the last few years. They've been pumping out a lot of articles that have really pushed the Russiagate narrative to its zenith. For instance, they released a whole bunch of reports which accused pretty much every political party in Europe that was out with this beltway between, liberal and conservative as being the Kremlin's Trojan horses. So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, on the left, it was Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, and on the right, it was the UKIP party that were both secretly controlled by Putin somehow, or in Spain, it was Vox and Podemos, or in Italy, it was Lega Nord and the Five Star Movement, or in Greece, it was Syriza and Golden Dawn. And so they've really been talking a lot about how Russia is secretly controlling our politics, increasingly controlling our social media. And they've been offering their services to a lot of big companies to try to protect against that. And so what we've seen recently, for instance, Facebook has partnered with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Lab. And what the Atlantic Council do for them is essentially curate the news feeds of 2.8 billion people worldwide who use Facebook. The Atlantic Council essentially help Facebook decide what news should be promoted, what posts should be discarded, deleted, or demonetized. And that has really led to a situation where a lot of alternative media have been utterly smashed by the algorithm changes. And we've seen quote unquote verifiable authoritative sources like Fox News or CNN being pushed up the rankings by Facebook to the point where a lot of alternative media have pretty much given up on the platform in its entirety. Earlier this year, we also saw Facebook hire a former NATO press officer, Ben Nimmo, as its chief of intelligence. So there's another kind of link in the growing network of partnerships between Silicon Valley and Washington national security state apparatus. So yeah, I mean, one other thing I can say is that Twitter has also joined this game. In 2019, very interestingly, it was revealed that a senior Twitter executive who was actually responsible for the entire Middle East region, he was outed as an active duty officer in the British Army's 77th Brigade, which is their unit which is dedicated to online warfare and psychological operations. And the reaction to this is perhaps more important than the reality of what happened. The reaction was pretty much a big shrug of the shoulders in the US. This came at a time when people were getting increasingly worried about foreign manipulation of social media. And yet when this verifiable fact happened, there was only one national news outlet which even mentioned it, and that was Newsweek. I interviewed that journalist, and he was essentially forced out a few weeks later, talking about how there was such a stifling top-down range of censorship on certain issues that he preferred to just walk away rather than get fired. So I think we're living in this era where when groups like the Atlantic Council, considering who is on their board, are shaping the sort of news we see, which is, of course, really important. I mean, Facebook is the biggest supplier of news to Americans and to Europeans and to people all around the world. Far more people rely on it than for television channels or newspapers. When a group like the Atlantic Council is essentially deciding what everybody around the world sees and reads in their news feeds, that is tantamount to state censorship on an enormous level, on a global scale. And that's something that everybody who is interested in democracy and freedom of expression should certainly be looking into.
Absolutely. And just recently, I mean, the last, 24 hours, the US government seized, speaking of, freedom of speech and freedom of expression online and control of the internet and social media tech giants, the United States seized over, I think it was like over 30 Iranian linked websites and, Muslim Shia religious organization websites under the guise of, fighting terrorism or, sanctions laws. So very clearly, there's a direct link between, the past, I would say, like 6 years of these social media tech giants, the national security state working directly with these think tanks to take control over the free flow of information, to control the narrative, and to ensure that only corporate media, and corporate journalists and their narratives that support the U.S. military-industrial complex and U.S. Imperialism basically reign supreme on the internet. I think people are slowly coming around to the idea that the internet is not completely, open, lawless space where you can just do anything, post anything, but actually a medium created and controlled by the U.S. government. Talk to me about the origins of the internet and this recent seizure of these websites.
Yeah, so as you said, I think there's quite a popular view in the public that the internet is this wonderful, unregulated space that, and in the 90s and 2000s, there was a lot of sort of tech utopianism around the internet, thinking that, perhaps this system will actually set us free and increase the connections between people on different sides of the planet, and it will, launch a new wave, a new era of understanding that will help everyone. But I think now we're living in the 2020s. We can say that really was pretty rose-tinted, and actually quite the opposite has happened in certain aspects. And of course, if you look at the history of the internet, it's not this sort of stateless, lawless place. It was there are very real, concrete beginnings to the internet, and it came out of the U.S. Military's DARPANET. And so much of the funding from the early days of the internet went into big universities like in California or Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This is really where the internet was first begun. And what that means is that it's really an American operation, and the American government has significant control over it. And we saw that with the US banning press TV, as you said, recently. But what a lot of people might not know is that any domain which ends in .com, .org, .net, or .tv, the US government does indeed have the power to seize it and take it down from the internet. So while we think about cyberspace as this very nebulous thing which doesn't really exist in reality, these servers actually do have a very real physical location, and most of them are in the US. And with the same with social media, all these companies that we think are international are actually very much based in the US, most of them in California.
Right.
And and the United States government really does have can exert a lot of pressure on these companies. One example is just in early 2020, when the Trump administration assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. The Iranians were obviously rather upset about this. Soleimani, according to US polls, was the most popular living person in the country. He had an approval rating of over 80% among Iranians. But because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the organization he led, was designated a terrorist group by the Trump administration, that meant that it was illegal for Facebook and Instagram, American companies, to carry any message which could be seen as promoting them or in support of them. Now, Instagram is super popular in Iran. It's estimated that around 1/3 of all people have an Instagram account. And that meant that Facebook, its parent company, was forced to delete messages opposing the killing of General Soleimani and presenting him as a hero. A lot of the time, these messages were in Farsi, written by Iranians to other Iranians, and they were representing very much a majority opinion in that country. But because Trump had decided that Soleimani was indeed a terrorist, that meant that Facebook and Instagram had to act on his behalf. We've also seen social media companies deleting tens of thousands of accounts from Iran, from China, from Venezuela, from Cuba. It always, however, seems that they find illegal activity or suspicious bot networks coming from enemies of the United States government and never emanating from the US or its allies itself, even though many of these countries are semi-open about the fact that they do manipulate social media in much the same way that Russia or China or Iran is accused of doing. And so much of 2020 was punctuated by kind of a hysteria over increased Chinese influence over the internet. I'm thinking about the TikTok controversy where Mike Pompeo would go on television and say, don't let your children use TikTok because you are essentially using a tool of the Chinese Communist Party or the Red Army. There was the big controversy over Huawei developing a 5G network that was going to be pretty much independent of US control. And so there's this real battle going on for the internet right now. And the hardware is very much something that can be used to control and manipulate the global means of communication. And that's why the US is so interested in keeping that control very much within its own hands.
Right. And obviously these, social media tech giants working with the think tanks and working directly with the national security state and the US government are ensuring that what's being propped up on social media are journalists that work for the national security state. You, as our senior staff writer, you wrote this incredible investigation called The Notorious London Spy School, churning out many of the world's top journalists. You detail how this Department of War Studies is breeding ground for both the world's top spies and the world's top journalists, that obviously social media tech giants are happy to prop up and celebrate while suppressing independent journalists and independent media outlets. Talk to us about your investigation.
Yeah, that really came out of a previous investigation I did into Bellingcat, which presents itself as this kind of information network for the people, this open source investigative outlet, which, is kind of governmentless. But when you really start looking at where they get their funding and who is actually writing the articles, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that this is just a sort of Western government front operation. Mm-hmm. What I found when I was looking at Bellingcat was that so many of the people who write for them all went to the same college and did the same postgraduate degree at the same department in the same college in the same university in London, which is the Department of War Studies. And I decided to look at their academics. And it is remarkable the amount of people who are active duty officers in NATO member states. So, basically directors of NATO. We have a former Director General of NATO on the teaching staff, former UK Minister of Defense, former CIA agents, former Israeli Defense Forces officers, also a lot of members of very hawkish think tanks, which are funded by both the US and UK governments. And in fact, the Department of War Studies actually presents itself as somewhere and pitches itself to Western security organizations as somewhere where they should actually send their operatives. In a CIA publication, or in an article that was published in the CIA's in-house journal, two King's College academics actually said that, it's really good for organizations like the CIA to have more people with an academic background, as it really enriches their intelligence gathering opportunities and their skills. And, this is it's kind of an open secret that the Department of War Studies is the place that Western spies and spooks go to be trained. So, Leon Panetta, who at the time was former CIA director and was also Secretary of Defense for the US at the time, he went to London in 2013 to give a talk there and said he was profoundly thankful for the work they did there in training what he said was the future national security leaders, many of whom are in this audience with me tonight. And so it's kind of an open secret, as I said, that, this place is, a breeding ground for spies and spooks. That's very worrying because as I looked more into this department, it also seemed that so many of the world's top journalists also graduate from the same small study group, do the same postgraduate course in the same department. So we see senior members of the BBC, of CNN, of Al Jazeera, producers for NBC News have all graduated from this school. And news organizations from around the world have alumni from the Department of War Studies working in very high positions. One example I could give you is Andrew Carey, who made a little bit of news recently. He's the CNN Jerusalem bureau chief. He recently sent an internal memo that was leaked to CNN, to all CNN employees who write about the Middle East, saying that whenever we talk about the Ministry of Health in Gaza, we have to remind all our viewers or listeners that the Ministry of Health is controlled by Hamas. Because, of course, this was at the time when Israel was bombing Gaza, killing dozens of people. And so they had to say, remember the Gazan Ministry of Health who are saying hundreds of people are dying. That's Hamas. So they were undermining the entire Palestinian side of the argument very carefully and consciously. And so I suppose it's not really an accident that this is happening, that so many people are being trained at the same school that spies and journalists are coming out of, because unfortunately there is an increasingly close relationship between big media and big government. If you turn on your TV set and watch cable news, you are almost bound to see former CIA officials, former DEA officials, or former FBI officials on there, John Brennan, James Clapper, Michael Hayden. Everybody does it, from Fox to CNN to NBC to MSNBC. They're all there. A lot of them even, present shows. Anderson Cooper famously was a former CIA intern. Tucker Carlson from Fox News applied to the CIA but was rejected. And somebody like Mika Brzezinski on MSNBC, well, her father is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's like the Democrats' version of Henry Kissinger, somebody who planned wars for decades, wars in Afghanistan, dirty wars in Central America. These are the sorts of people who we are supposed to be relying on to hold the powerful accountable. But when you actually look at their backgrounds, they're part of this same power system themselves. And so that's really what this article was really getting at, is that unfortunately, there seems to be no real difference between big media and big government anymore. And that's a real problem for an open society and democracy in general.
Well, didn't Noam Chomsky famously say any dictator would admire the conformity of the US media system here in the United States? And this is, you just brilliantly laid it all out in such simplistic terms about, the crossover between the national security state and and journalists. Let's talk a little bit about the algorithms and censorship that's taking place against alternative and independent media. Do you think this problem of government control and manipulation of media will get better or worse in the short term?
I think the short answer to that is it's much more likely to get worse than better. What we've seen since the rise of Donald Trump and the very surprising victory, which shocked pretty much everyone in Washington and people around the world as well, was the quote unquote establishment, the Democratic establishment, and the media who had been lambasting Trump for months needed some sort of excuse or reasoning for why the most unpopular person who's ever run for president for a major political party managed to beat out this seasoned professional, this longtime veteran of Washington in Hillary Clinton. And very quickly, the Clinton campaign and the media seemed to coalesce around the idea that the problem was online disinformation that had been pushed by foreign countries, particularly Russia. And so what happened in 2016 and 2017 was that big social media outlets like Reddit, like Facebook, Twitter, Google, and YouTube changed their algorithms to reportedly push more authoritative news sources and derank, delist, or demote fake news or very low quality news. And, fair enough, there was certainly a lot of absolute nonsense being widely circulated in 2015 and 2016. But I think the main effect of those algorithmic changes has been to promote legacy media like CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, the Washington Post or what have you, to new levels of authority, pushing them up the rankings to first in the Google search or number one on YouTube, and pushing out what they call borderline content to the margins. So it's pretty rare that things get deleted. But if you consign something to page 5 of a Google search, nobody's going to see it. And so what we've seen is really high quality independent media have been completely smashed by this algorithmic change. I know MintPress has been particularly badly affected, but Democracy Now! Or The Intercept or Common Dreams or Counterpunch have all seen disastrous drops in Google traffic almost overnight. And we see the same with YouTube creators as well. Anyone who's in this sort of political realm, but is outside that sort of beltway, that establishment, has seen their subscriber count essentially flatline. Right. Their videos are not being promoted by the YouTube algorithm, whereas authoritative sources like CNN or Fox or what have you are really pushed up to number 1 and number 2, and they're constantly pushed on us. But the problem is that most of us have gone to the internet as a way of finding an alternative or an antidote to this stifling conformity of corporate media that we see when we either buy a newspaper or switch on the radio or turn on the television, where it's just pretty much one of two pretty much identical opinions when it comes to war or foreign policy or economics, and two partisan elitist groups just shouting at each other about issues that don't really affect that many people worldwide. And so, unfortunately, borderline content has been completely removed, or at least disincentivized. And in fact, last year, Facebook even admitted that it was deliberately censoring the outlet Mother Jones because it saw itself as a bit too left-wing for its liking. Now, anyone who reads Mother Jones will see it's kind of a very sort of milquetoast liberal publication. Yes. So if they're admitting that they're doing that to Mother Jones, what are they doing to outlets like MintPress or Grey Zone or Counterpunch or Common Dreams or whatever? It's when you start thinking about it like that, it's a really huge change that nobody talked about, nobody voted about, and in fact, most people don't even know has happened. And that is a huge red flag for a democracy.
Absolutely. And I just want to kind of bounce off of what you said about, how social media algorithms have affected independent media. Before the 2016 elections, for example, like MintPress was still like a fresh new independent media outlet, and we were getting between anywhere from 100 to 150,000 unique visitors to our website every single day, which is like incredible for independent media. I mean, this was like at a time when you launched a website, there was like, you could make it to the top, and we were registered under Google News. We were approved for that. And we were appearing literally on the first page of Google News, sometimes at the very, very top. And so, we were also able to monetize from a lot of the content that we were publishing, because we had such a high traffic for such a small website. But slowly but surely, those things started to change in the last 4 years as this cry for cracking down on Russian disinformation and any sort of kind of fake news. And then all of a sudden we saw, like you described and explained, how social media tech giants partnered up with these hawkish think tanks and the national security state to basically crack down. And so what we started to see was this like decline in our readership, and we weren't able to get as many readers from Facebook like we used to get. And now we're like struggling. It's like we're like pushing through, but like we can't break that ceiling. They've put a block on us. And then we used to make the trends. MintPress used to be on the trends. Our articles used to make it to the trends. We used to go viral. We used to be at the top of Reddit. Those things are just basically impossible now to happen. Another thing I wanted to mention is like the Google ad violations, where we're obviously moving away from Google ads completely. But Google ad violations, like on almost a weekly basis, we're getting Google ad violations threatening to demonetize articles because we're covering war crimes. I remember bringing attention to an article that we published about U.S. human rights abuses at Abu Ghraib, and Google demonetized that article because it was, went against their like standards, and then demonetization of a lot of YouTube content as well. So there's clearly a deliberate effort to suppress and throttle and shadow ban independent outlets. So I think, we've talked about a lot of things here. They're all related, of course. And Alan, you are just like this wealth of information, this source of so much information. It's so good to talk to you. And I'm sure everyone who's listening is really learning a lot from you. I mean, you truly are a scholar. You truly are a scholar. I think people are trying to figure out, like, what is the solution? I mean, we talk about this issue so much. And like, what is the solution? I mean, people have called for like boycotts of social media tech giants, like get off Facebook, get off Twitter, get off Instagram, go to alternative social media outlets. But then the mass people are not actually migrating over to these alternatives. I mean, I feel like there is a better solution, but what do you think the solution is based off of your research?
Yeah, I mean, we do live in an upside down world where the people most crying for censorship seem to be journalists, or, the top journalists in our nation. And that's really worrying, especially because so many of the biggest outlets are the ones most responsible for the biggest fake news stories of the 21st century, like, for instance, the WMD hoax in Iraq. So we do live in this very difficult world where, unfortunately, the internet isn't this sort of free place where everybody has an equal say, but is in fact quite closely regulated now. I suppose in terms of solutions, there's kind of individual solutions and there's a more group solution. For individuals, I always recommend deliberately trying to go out of your little bubble and trying to look for news, perhaps from different countries, perhaps from rival countries. There's so many outlets that publish stuff in English, whether it's from the Middle East or from Russia or from Latin America, and you'll get to see a completely different viewpoint. You'll get to see or hear figures that just won't appear in our corporate media here, and that's very good to help you triangulate what's going on in your own media. It doesn't mean you have to believe what they say, but it helps you for once see that there is a different opinion, and you can start to work out what the spectrum is. I think it's imperative that people who really believe in a free media start to think about ways that they can support those media and get those media either more money or more attention or help them in some way. thankfully, I think in the last couple of years, we've really seen the idea of donating to small media outlets increase. We've seen, sites like Patreon become very popular, and journalists can make a living there, and so can independent media outlets. But I mean, I guess there are other tactics that we can try, and like just trying to break the stranglehold of big tech on our things. We can maybe try to get our outlets directly mail shotted to people, so they're not really going through the medium of a Facebook algorithm or a Google algorithm. But these things are absolutely an uphill battle, and so it's certainly not easy. But first things first, we have to at least recognize there's a problem. And then I think also alternative media really has to try and find a way to work together and see there is in all of our common interests to go back to a system that's much more free and open. Because otherwise we're just going to see the internet turn into basically what the television is, where it's a very limited form of expression. And maybe if you know about a certain website, you can find alternative opinions. But ultimately, if the tools you're using to look for opinions on news are controlled by big corporations, the biggest corporations in the world in some cases, that is hugely problematic. And so, I don't really have the answer of what we should do, but there's certainly things that we can do, which is put our money where our mouth is, try and help independent media as much as possible, try to be much more conscious and active consumers of news and really think about things, and also go back to face-to-face organizing as well, because it's remarkable how much more convincing a real person is than some person online. You might think that you've got 800 friends on Facebook, but I can tell you that actually talking to someone face-to-face is much more valuable than getting a thumbs up on Facebook or a heart on Twitter.
That's absolutely correct. And I actually was just talking about this. I said the same thing or something similar during the surveillance capitalism panel that I was speaking on as well. We have to detach and break our addiction from social media, because actually social media tech giants and the US government, the national security state, they want us to be addicted and glued to our screens, while they are in reality in the real world are completely plundering us, pushing this divide and conquer narrative. They're able to push through with their agenda while we are sitting there glued to our screens, getting these dopamine rushes because we're getting that like, or we're getting that, care heart on Facebook. And something, Alan, that I definitely agree with you with is we have to put our money where our mouth is in support of independent journalism. When I was doing the live streams in the last month, I started each live stream reminding people that we have to work together and support independent media by helping us beat social media algorithms by sharing our live streams. The same goes for, this segment for the MintCast podcast. If you're watching this, obviously you should be following Alan MacLeod on social media. He's an investigative journalist. He's our senior staff writer. And I'm so proud to be working with you, Alan. You're such a wealth of information. And support MintPress as well, through Patreon and to make this show, this program possible. But that is a wrap for today. Alan, it was such a joy to speak with you. I learned so much from you every time I speak to you. I really appreciate you being here and explaining this issue to us so much.
Oh, it was great to speak to you again.
Thank you, Alan. All right. So just a reminder that the MintCast podcast is available on our YouTube channel in video format, like you're seeing us now. But if you prefer, this also comes in a podcast format. You can find it on Spotify and iTunes if you look up MintCast. That's a wrap. We will see you guys next week. Thank you.